Welcome to the first of your Flip lectures. In this lecture, we're going to talk about 9/11 and the War on Terror, and essentially the United States in the world. When we're talking about the modern era, it's very, very difficult to call it history, because history is constantly happening. In order to write good history, which means that you are analyzing the events and understanding kind of how they change things, you need some distance from them. You need some objectivity. It's very hard to be objective about something that's going on in the time that you are living. And also, the more time you have, the more you can measure influences and changes. So there's a debate about whether or not there can even be a modern history because events are so controversial. So basically, I'm just going to seek to present you facts without my historical opinions. So the first thing we're going to look at is the idea of the United States in the world. And we're going to look at foreign policy during the age of superpower and the war on terror. We talk a lot about watershed moments, and a really big moment in the history of the world, and especially United States history, was the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. This picture is of the Berlin Wall, and when it came down, that symbolically ended the Cold War. I've talked before about the idea of watershed moments, about these ideas in history, just like the roof of this house, that we can talk about that things are essentially very, very different on this side than they are on this side. So when we talk about the end of the Cold War, that's a watershed moment, and that pretty much everything in the United States is going to change once that happens. But it's important to understand that the international balance of power changes over time. The United States was not always the most powerful country in the world. In fact, it used to not be a very powerful country at all. So let's look at kind of how international power has changed over time. From 1500 to 1945, European nations dominated world affairs. They had colonies, the age of exploration, and basically, European countries were the most powerful countries in the world for that very, very long period of time. However, World War I and World War II ended that dominance. These wars destroyed the European continent, destroyed the countries, sent the governments into upheaval, and basically ended the era where European countries would control things. At the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union would emerge as the two most powerful countries in the world, and they were the most powerful countries by far. This began the Cold War, where basically the United States, which is a democracy and a capitalist society, went up against the Soviet Union, which was a communist authoritarian society in both government and economy. And so the USA and USSR, which is the Soviet Union, basically got involved in almost every conflict in the developed world, in basically this battle to see what countries were going to be communist and what countries were going to have democracies. So for a shorter period of time than the European dominance, the Soviet Union and the United States dominated world affairs. But in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, which left the United States as the most powerful nation with really no other nations to rival it. This meant that in the modern era, the United States was going to be very, very important, but would also have to figure out how to deal with all of that power. So where are we now? We are in a place where the United States is the only remaining superpower in the world and has a lot of influence in both economics, politics, and with the military. But this has also led to a debate over what the role of the United States should be in the rest of the world and how the United States should deal with other nations. However, things are changing, and emerging powers such as China, India, and Brazil could develop into superpowers and challenge the United States' status. For a lot of people, modern America and the modern United States began at 8:46 in the morning on September 11th of 2001. President George W. Bush, who was reading to children, was told by his advisors that America is under attack. The World Trade Center in New York City had been attacked by airplanes. Hijackers from the Al-Qaeda network had hijacked planes and flown them into both World Trade Center buildings, resulting in their destruction. Likewise, a plane crashed into the Pentagon, which is in Virginia near Washington, D.C., and is the headquarters of the United States military. Another plane, Flight 93, crashed into Pennsylvania. The reason for this crash was that passengers realized what was happening after the planes had crashed into the World Trade Center towers. As a result of this, the passengers tried to retake the plane and caused it to crash into a field in Pennsylvania. No one is quite sure what the target of Flight 93 was going to be, but all the passengers on board were killed in this attempt.
Bound to be staggering
That's
as the
right.
day progresses.
Aboard those airplanes alone, 266 people have lost their lives. That was confirmed by both United and American Airlines, and we are unclear, as Matt just said, about the perhaps thousands of people who have been killed and certainly injured as a result of what happened in New York City and outside Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon. With more, here's Tom.
This is an NBC News special report. Here is Tom Brokaw.
September 11th, the year 2001, a day unlike any other in the long course of American history, a terrorist act of war against this country. President Bush saying today that freedom has been attacked by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. Not since Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941, has this country undergone such a devastating and damaging attack. And it may not yet be over. We do know at this time that at least 4 targets have been attacked. The 2 Twin Trade Tower centers here in New York City, the Pentagon, and then another plane that was crashed deliberately into an area outside of Pittsburgh. That is the second plane hitting the Twin Trade Towers this morning. All of them hijacked airliners. Then these 2 colossal icons of the American capitalist system collapsed in lower Manhattan. The death toll at this hour is unknown, but it is expected to be, as Mayor Giuliani has said, horrendous. Shortly after those attacks on the Twin Trade Towers in New York City, at the Pentagon, in one of the outer rings, another hijacked airliner crashed into 2 areas there, killing an untold number of U.S. military personnel in Washington, D.C. A code red was put in effect in the nation's capital. The White House, State Department, CIA evacuated along with the Pentagon. House Speaker Dennis Hastert was evacuated to a secure area. President Bush, who was in Florida for an appearance for an education project, was evacuated to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where we do expect to hear from him before too long. The United States is, in effect, in a national state of emergency. All domestic flights were grounded immediately. Most flights that were already in the air, we believe, will arrive safely at their destinations. The borders between the United States and Canada and the United States and Mexico have been closed. Transatlantic flights were diverted to Canada. U.S. military forces in this country and around the world have been put on the highest possible alert. Aircraft carriers were moved to waters off New York City as this scene played out in the nerve center of this country, lower Manhattan, the financial markets, an area that is home to literally hundreds of thousands of people. They are still dealing with the carnage in lower Manhattan. We want to go now to NBC's David Bloom, who is in Midtown Manhattan, overlooking all of this. As you can see there, communications have been severely interrupted. David?
Well, Tom, what we're looking at behind us more than 4 hours after the first explosion is the smoking hulk of the essentially vanished World Trade Center. As you've said, the essential question at this hour in New York City is how many people may have died in these attacks. The various officials here in New York City believe that the casualty estimates will essentially go into the thousands and thousands of people. Here is the sequence of events as they happened at this hour. The first plane attacks the World Trade Center's South Tower. at approximately 8:42 Eastern Time. Airline officials say at least 2 American Airlines flights and 2 United Airlines flights were hijacked today, and that the attack planes were the hijacked domestic flights. Roughly 21 minutes later, approximately 9:03 Eastern Time, the second large jetliner can be seen taking dead aim at the World Trade Center's North Tower. Emergency officials estimate 20,000 or more people may have been inside the 2 110-story buildings at the time of the attacks. Eyewitnesses report victims falling and in some cases jumping from the 2 buildings. At approximately 9:40 a.m. in Washington, D.C., a third hijacked plane crashes into the Pentagon in a burst of flames, one side of the building collapsing. Non-essential personnel from federal buildings, including the White House and the U.S. Capitol, are evacuated. 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. An unknown number of people still trapped inside. 1/2 hour later, at approximately 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. Rubble, debris spreading for blocks. In a separate but apparently related crash, a fourth hijacked plane, a Boeing 767, crashes in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The FAA closes all domestic airports, shutting down all U.S. airspace. So again, Tom, 4 hijacked airplanes. We know what happened to each of the 4. Other officials investigating now, both apparently the worst terrorist attack in the mainland United States ever. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's David Bloom. What we don't know is who may be responsible for these attacks. There's a lot of speculation, obviously, about Osama bin Laden, who is a Saudi dissident who is believed to be harbored somewhere in Afghanistan, but no one is claiming responsibility. In the West Bank, however, the Palestinians in the streets are cheering and celebrating these attacks on the United States, even though Palestinian leaders have condemned the attacks. We want to go now to NBC's Pat Dawson, who is down near the World Trade Center, because the big question, obviously, in New York City.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
I want you all to know, you can't go any louder. I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon. The nation sends its love and compassion. God bless America! To everybody who is here. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for making the nation proud. And may God bless America.
In the days following 9/11, the United States declared a national emergency, and the President and Congress declared the war on terrorism. This involved Congress giving the president increased authority to decide when and where to use United States soldiers and intelligence operators to combat terrorism. Traditionally, these decisions are not taken lightly, and so for Congress to give the president additional freedom in order to use these soldiers was a very, very big deal. U.S. intelligence also investigated 9/11 and found that Osama bin Laden and the al-Qaeda network were responsible for these attacks. Osama bin Laden was a well-known terrorist before 2001, and basically they are considered Islamist extremists as well as very anti-American. The War on Terror also was meant to target states that would support terrorist networks. This would lead to the invasion of Afghanistan. The president was quoted as saying in the days after 9/11 that any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime. This is a photo of Osama bin Laden taken sometime in the 1990s. This is the man responsible for planning the 9/11 attacks. Since then, Osama bin Laden was actually found and he was killed in a firefight with U.S. Special Forces. But his network, the al-Qaeda network, still lives on and operates to this day. Now, al-Qaeda is not one massive network. It's actually made up of a lot of small terrorist groups, which makes it harder for the United States and other countries to basically destroy them all at once. This group is considered a militant fundamentalist Islamist organization. Militant meaning that they are armed and they are trained in the use of weapons, and they are fundamental Islamist because they believe that their interpretation of the Muslim faith is the only interpretation of religion that can happen. And so they believe that everybody who opposes their beliefs are their enemies. So what is the War on Terror? The War on Terror has a lot of different aspects to it. The first is military intervention abroad. This means that the United States goes into other countries and basically tries to combat terrorism wherever it's found. This includes targeted strikes of terrorist cells, such as the drone strikes of President Obama and missile strikes of other presidents, as well as actions against nations. This would involve the Afghanistan war, where the United States will actually go into a country that sponsors terrorism and invade. The second aspect is the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. This is a department that combined a bunch of different departments into one central location whose job is to provide security for the citizens of the United States. The War on Terror also involved freezing money of suspected terrorists and their supporters. The idea being that if the terrorists didn't have access to money, then they would be unable to carry out their plots. The most controversial aspects of the War on Terror have got to involve the increased domestic security and increased power for law enforcement. The greatest example of this is the United States Patriot Act that was passed in the weeks and months following 9/11. The reason this is controversial is because some of the new provisions, new powers that are given to law enforcement, allow them to secretly wiretap, make secret searches without warrants, track emails, and do all sorts of other things that violate the Fourth Amendment rights of citizens against illegal search and seizure. This is a really great example of the idea of personal freedoms and liberties coming in contact with the idea that people in the United States want security and want to maintain order. So the War on Terror can be considered a really great example of that theme in United States history. A lot of people made the claim that 9/11 changed everything about the United States, and surely the War on Terrorism does change a couple of things about the United States. Firstly, it greatly expands the power of the president to use the U.S. military. Previously, the United States hadn't been very interventionist. The experiences of the Vietnam War and other disasters had meant that the United States didn't exercise its military power in a very large way since 1975. That would change under the War on Terrorism, as the United States would use the U.S. military to combat terrorism abroad. This also changes the United States because it greatly expanded the power of local, state, and federal police and actually limited constitutional protections in some cases. This has proved to be very controversial, and again, the debate between order and liberty rages on. Another very visible thing that comes out of the War on Terror is the idea that we have tighter security and regulations. If you have flown on an airplane, then you know that airport security is very, very tight. It didn't used to be that way. In fact, you used to be able to walk up to the terminal without a ticket and greet your family or friend as they came off of the plane. This also increased people's idea that border security was a very, very important thing, because there was a fear that terrorists would simply be able to get to the United States through the Mexican and Canadian borders. And also, even if you just notice going into buildings, maybe at work, that security is a lot tighter, and it would continue to be well after 9/11. So here's a quick who's who for the War on Terror. This is George W. Bush, the president, and all of his closest advisors. On the far left is Colin Powell, the Secretary of State. He was a former general and a general during the first Gulf War. The man next to him, sitting down, is Dick Cheney. He was a vice president of the United States, and he had served previous presidents during conflicts as well. The man in the middle is George W. Bush, the president of the United States. Next to him, sitting down, is Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor. Condoleezza Rice is considered one of the foremost experts on foreign policy and was very involved as an advisor in the decisions with the War on Terror. The man standing in the back is Andrew Card, the White House Chief of Staff. He was a top advisor to George W. Bush and was involved in the War on Terror. The man in front of him, George Tenet, was the head of the CIA. And essentially, George W. Bush would look to him in order to get all the intelligence about the terror networks. And the man on the far right is Donald Rumsfeld, the United States Secretary of Defense, whose advice would lead George W. Bush through the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the United States had been attacked on September 11, 2001. And now, with a clear enemy in mind, the United States had to set out to try to decide how it would act in the modern world.